Amen. Thank you. So we've been going over the one another passages, and this evening we're going to be talking about being hospitable towards one another. And before we get started, I do need to give credit to somebody because I'm on the mailing list for Brent Hunter. I don't know if any of you know him very well, but he's a guy on the West Coast. He's originally from the East Coast in Florida there. But he sends out his PowerPoint slides, every week for his sermons, and he preached on hospitality recently, and I really benefited from that. And so, hey, Brent, if he's watching, which there's probably little chance that he is, notices that a lot of the points are similar to his. That's because I found his information really useful. So I always want to give credit where credit is due, for sure. But as we kind of have been going through these, the reason this series is kind of helpful for me as I study these passages, and there's around 60 one another passages, give or take, is it helps us really see in practical ways how we can love each other, and all that's implied in being part of the body of Christ. We are one body, and when you think about a body, the body you get is the body you get, and you're stuck with that body. And so how do we make it work with each other? How do we show love to each other? How do we take care of each other the way that we would take care of our own physical bodies? And I think that when you read the one another passages, it really kind of illuminates that. At least it does for me. And so a while back, we talked about hospitality in a sermon, and I promised I didn't just take that old sermon and make it into a class. I think it's one thing to talk about this and to give a sermon version of it. It's another thing to actually have a conversation about it in the class format. And so I just want to briefly talk about what is hospitality. And for our English word, it comes from this Latin word, which simply means to host. And so you have this idea of hosting individuals in your home and all the things that go along with hosting individuals in your home. But I think that we're more interested in the Greek word, which is philoxenos. Maybe that's close, I don't know. But that's really just a mashup of two Greek words. You have philo, which, any guesses as to what that is? Love, right? Brotherly love. And then xenos, what do you suppose that means? Stranger, right? That's a less common one. But we're pretty familiar with that word, brotherly love. And so you put those two things together, and what do you have? Love of strangers, right? That's really basically what this word means. And when you look at the Bible, I think you see kind of these people that we would consider as standouts in God's plan. You kind of see the role of hospitality kind of pop in and out of Scripture, and starting with the man Abraham. So does anybody remember that strange verse in the book of Hebrews? I think I'll have it on my slide eventually. But it talks about not neglecting hospitality. And does anybody remember the reason why the Hebrew writer says not to neglect it? Right. And so I kind of have a feeling that he's talking about, Abraham. And you remember that story in Genesis 18 where Abraham is kind of hanging out by his tent, and three guys walk up. And now after the fact, we realize that these are, some sort of heavenly beings, God's messengers, angels. And he notices these three guys, and I'm not sure if he realizes that they're angels yet at this point or not. But what does he do when he sees these three individuals that are just kind of walking by his camp? What does he do? Yeah, and there's this sense of urgency about it. In fact, when you read the text, it's like he runs in and he tells Sarah, hey, get everything ready, make some loaves, and he goes and slaughters an animal and presents it to them. But the verse here is Genesis 18, verses 3 through 5, and Abraham talks to them, and talks to one of them in particular. Says, "My Lord, if I've found favor with you, please do not go past your servant. Let a little water be brought, that you may wash your feet, rest yourselves under the tree. I will bring a bit of bread so that you may strengthen yourselves. This is why you've passed your servant's way. Later, you can continue on." And so I kind of like to think, and I don't know if it's the case, but I like to think that at this point, Abraham has no idea that these guys are God's angels. But in either case, I want you to see that it's Abraham that initiates this. These guys walk by, and it's not like they walk up to Abraham and say, hey, can you give us some food? It's Abraham who's imploring them. He's saying, please stay with me. And he takes care of them. And it looks like he's done it before. And I have a feeling that this is something that Abraham, it was just kind of common practice. And I know historically when you look at things and read about this, that when people were traveling, they depended on the hospitality of others along the way because, you didn't have gas stations, right, on the way to this far distant land. You had to stop and ask people for help when you saw their places where they lived established. And so I think you have an example of this here, and I just think Abraham kind of stands out as an example of hospitality. But when you look at the New Testament, it seemed to be something that characterized that first century church, and I'm always impressed by Lydia, because Lydia shows hospitality, but it's like right when she becomes a Christian. And so when Paul preaches her the gospel, what does she do after Paul preaches the gospel to Paul, or what does she do after Paul preaches the gospel to her? She becomes a believer, and what does she do at that point? Do we remember that? Somebody have it? Acts 16 and verse 15. Somebody want to read that for me?
When she and her household were baptized, she begged us, saying, "If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house instead." So she persuaded us,
and mine says, I think, she prevailed upon us. And so you kind of, again, get this sense of urgency, that this is something that Lydia is insisting upon. Perhaps the apostles are saying, no, I don't want to put you out. But she is begging them, I think is what Larry's version said there, for them to stay with her so that she can take care of them. And this, again, in Philippi kind of becomes their home base for where they can rest, where they can be fed, and where they can leave and go throughout the day and evangelize in Philippi. And so she just stands out to me as this example of hospitality. What about Aquila and Priscilla? So Paul's in Corinth, and who does he end up staying with? Obviously, Priscilla and Aquila, right? In Acts 18 and verse 3, it says Paul stayed with them, that he finds this Jew, and it says that he stays with them. And that's really interesting to me because what is it that Aquila and Priscilla did for a living? What is it that Paul did for a living? So you're talking about your competition coming to stay with you, right? And so they're an example of hospitality. The Jerusalem church, Acts 2 and verse 46, they're devoted to a number of things, but what is mentioned? What do they do from house to house? Again, somebody can read that if they want to. Acts 2 and verse 46.
day by day, continually, one wine and people, breaking bread from house to house, and taking the meal together with gladness and
And so they were going from house to house, and I think in that context, you're talking about sharing meals together and spending time with one another, practicing hospitality. And so this is something that you see characterize that first century church. And so we should expect to read some other verses about it. I already mentioned this one, Hebrews 13 and verse 2, right? Don't neglect to show hospitality, for by doing this, some have welcomed angels as guests without knowing it. I love 1 Peter 4 and verse 9. Be hospitable to one another without complaining. Why does he tack that on there, you suppose? Yeah, it doesn't count if you complain about it. And you can tell when somebody's hosting you and they're not super thrilled about it too, right? But I think he says it as well because it's kind of common. It's not easy to be hospitable, is it? I don't think that they're asking us to do something with our expectation of it being that it's going to be easy. You all have hosted people, you've hosted large groups into your home, or maybe just one family into your home, and there's planning that goes into that. There's energy that's put into that. There's sacrifices, there's money put into that, and there's a lot of temptation to complain if we don't have the right attitude. And so it shouldn't surprise us that Peter says, hey, be hospitable, but make sure you do it without complaining, that this should be something that we're eager to do and to do it without complaining. Romans 12 and verse 13, share with the saints in their needs, pursue hospitality. And so I guess one thing that I want us to see is that in each of these passages, and I think Hebrews 13:2 is included, although I think it also implies taking care of strangers. But you notice in Hebrews 13 verse 1, it talks about maintaining brotherly love. But in each of these passages, you have this idea of hospitality being shown to brethren. to one another, to the saints. And so I think this is something that we're always looking to practice to those outside, but I think it's something we're particularly supposed to practice towards one another. And so much so that in Romans 12 and verse 13, mine says, pursue hospitality. I'm curious, what does your version say rather than pursue? What word is used instead? Okay, seek to show. Anybody else have something different? Practice. Okay. So when you look that up with my Bible software, I'm able to see how this word is translated in the New Testament. In the majority of the time, it's largely translated as persecute. And so what does that tell us if this is the word being used, and mine translates it again as pursue? What does that tell us about the seriousness with which we should approach being hospitable? Again, this is a word that's used of even persecuting Christians in context. That's the word that's used here. So how does that kind of help us see how serious we should take that?
Look at the preceding verse. It gives a lot of things that Christians should be don't be lazy, work hard, serve the Lord, enthusiastically, come in your hope, patience, keep praying. And so when God's people are in need, ready to help them, always be ready to practice hospitality. So practice hospitality when God's people are not in need, but certainly when they are in need, there should be greater demand for those brother brethren to be there.
Yeah, so there's this sense of urgency, and I think really in that whole list that you just read, that those are all things we're to take very seriously, and which one of those would we look at and say, well, this one's not as important as the other, right? And so he says, pursue hospitality. This is something that requires diligence. We're not just waiting for people to come to us to express a need, but this is something that we're actively seeking to do. We're looking for opportunities to do this. If you would turn over your Bibles to Matthew 25. This is kind of, I think, a key passage. Let's go over to Matthew 25. And I just feel like you cannot talk about hospitality and taking care of each other or taking care of strangers without looking at what Jesus says in Matthew 25. And so I'll just read a couple verses because I think we're all, for the most part, pretty familiar with this passage. We're talking about what I believe is judgment when Jesus comes back and how he's going to separate, the sheep from the goats, the saved versus the unsaved. And so in verse 40, after Jesus is saying, look, when I was hungry, you fed me, and kind of that whole passage there. In verse 40, it says, the king will answer them, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. And so they're asking, when did we do all these things that you're saying we did for you? And Jesus is saying, when you did it for the least of these, right? You did it to me. And then drop down to verses 44 through 46 after Jesus basically says the same thing, except now he's saying, you didn't feed me when I was hungry, and so on and so forth. In verse 44, he says, then they too will answer, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger or without clothes, or sick or in prison, and not help you? Then he will answer them, truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me. And they will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. And so I think he's talking about hospitality here and taking care of people, taking care of each other. How should reading that impact how we view the importance of hospitality? Yeah, and that's kind of a mystery to me. But when I read this, it seems like the amount of hospitality we show towards people, when we go out of our way to take care of somebody who's in need, when we have the ability and the opportunity to do so, there's something Jesus is saying here that's going to be taken into account. You notice he spends a big section on this. There's a lot of things he could have spent a lot of time on, but for some reason, he hones in on this idea of taking care of those in need. and not passing on the opportunity to do that when we're presented with it. And so this, to me, is kind of sobering, and how serious and how important this is, and how God wants us to do this. I want you to see as well in Luke 14, verses 12 through 13. Go ahead and turn over to that. Luke 14. Luke 14, verses 12 through 13. And this is when Jesus is sitting with one of the leading Pharisees, no doubt somebody who was looked up to, but probably also was somewhat wealthy. And I think Jesus says this for a reason, because it probably applied to the situation that this Pharisee was in. And Jesus says in Luke 14, verse 12, that he said to the one who had invited him, when you give a lunch or a dinner, don't invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors, because they might invite you back and you should be repaid. On the contrary, when you host a banquet, invite those who are poor, maimed, lame, or blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. So again, how does this maybe inform the way we approach hospitality? What's our mindset to be when we are looking at taking care of people, perhaps specifically in the context of inviting them over to our home and having a feast and taking care of them in that way?
That's real common.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen it for a lot of time. People be walking by the house, they're hungry, and mother would feed them. And that's nothing, of course, that's the same thing there. But mother done that a lot.
Yeah, that's impressive for your mother to have that reputation, to see somebody just walking by the house and feeding them. That's admirable.
Back in the 30s, that was as common as it could be.
Yeah. So, kind of going along with what Frank said there, how should this impact, what we just read when Jesus tells this to this Pharisee? How should that impact our approach to hospitality? Larry, you're going to say something? Yeah. You kind of get the impression that when Jesus says this to this Pharisee, there's a tendency to kind of, you had this brotherhood, right? And as you kind of work your way up the chain, you surround yourself with, more and more honorable company, so to speak. And, when you invite somebody over to your place, well, then you're doing it expecting that they're going to invite you over to theirs. And Jesus says, look, don't go into this expecting something in return. And so much so, he says, go to the extent and invite people who cannot repay you, who have nothing to offer in return. And so when we're practicing hospitality, I think it's really important that we're not doing it, as David said, with ulterior motives. And that could be as simple as just, hey, if I invite this person over, then they're going to invite me over. And if that's why we're doing it, that's not the right reason. We're doing it to take care of each other, to build each other up, and not doing it with some expectation that I'm going to get something out of it. Again, when you talk about the importance of hospitality, this guy Julian, he's called the Apostate. Who would like to be known as Julian the Apostate, or Sam the Apostate? He's known as the last pagan emperor. And he's kind of interesting. They call him Julian the Apostate because he was raised Christian. And he felt like Christianity was kind of forced on him. And so when he grew up, he became pagan and disdained Christians so much that he was looking to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, because he felt like if he did that, that would really slow down the Christians, because the Christians would point at the destruction of Jerusalem as kind of proof that Jesus was who he said he was. And so he was seeking to rebuild it in order to kind of snuff out Christianity. And so it's interesting when you read this guy who is not a Christian sympathizer at all. He says, generous hospitality and kindness shown to each other and to strangers is one of the reasons why so many are drawn to Christianity. And so he's saying that the main thing they got going for them is that they were so hospitable towards one another. And he goes on to say somewhere else, he says, these impious Galileans, so he's really speaking favorably, right, about Christians at this point. He says, they not only feed their own poor, but also ours. Welcoming them into their agape, they attract them as children are attracted with cakes. And so he noticed this about the Christian community, and so what he tried to do was actually set up ways to provide for the poor through the government and through the pagan religions that they had set up so that it would keep people from being drawn to Christianity. He was trying to compete with the charitableness that was seen in Christians because their hospitality was such a big factor in their community growing in his eyes. And so to me, when we talk about the importance of hospitality, one person says the hospitality is the front line of evangelism. And I've only been doing this for just a small amount of time, but so far I've found for myself in evangelizing to people and trying to teach people the gospel, I've really found that that's the case. So some of you might be familiar with the book, The Gospel Comes with a House Key. Anybody read this? David has, Amy has. I personally haven't read it. I know about the person who wrote it. I kind of know the story. I should sit down and read it. But this is her philosophy. The gospel comes with a house key. And she really takes it serious because this isn't somebody that was, just a Christian their whole life. She was living in New York. She was a lesbian feminist activist going to Syracuse College in New York. And one of the things that stuck out to her in that community that I find interesting that she talks about in a sit-down interview was that during that time when she was living that lifestyle, she said, we all depended on each other because this was 20 or really probably 30 years ago. And so, these things that are commonly accepted now weren't accepted back then. And so she said, we always had a home to go into. Talking about her homosexual community. We always had a home to go into. We always had that support. And that just is interesting to me that they have that level of support for each other, and I wonder how we compare to that as well. But she wrote an editorial in the newspaper, maybe it was for the New York Times or something like that, and it was critical of Christianity. I can't remember exactly what was said. And she got invited over to dinner at I think it was a Presbyterian minister's home. And so she took him up on it and was expecting, all right, I'm going to be able to basically grill this guy for free, and he's going to help me write this paper or whatever it was that she was working on at the time. And to her surprise, she went over there, and they were not judgmental, and they didn't try to preach the gospel to her. They didn't try and invite her to church. And they had a really nice meal, and then she went away. And she didn't go to their church for over 2 years, I think is what she said. And this went on for a long time where she was just invited over to their house and she was free to ask whatever question that she wanted to. They would have honest conversations and she was being critical of the Bible and had all these questions and, she was an unbeliever. Well, over time, guess what happened? She becomes a Christian. And it all started with hospitality, with having somebody over to her home or going over to somebody's home. And so she says in her book, those who live out radically ordinary hospitality. I want you to zero in on those words, right? We're not talking about doing something special. We're not talking about treating it like a special occasion every time we have somebody over. It's got to be radically ordinary. It's got to be just part of what we do and not something that we have, that we kind of get burnt out on easily because of the way we approach it. She says, those who live out radically ordinary hospitality see their homes not as theirs at all, but as God's gift to use for the furtherance of his kingdom. And I think that when we approach our earthly possessions, that kind of changes things, doesn't it, when we have that attitude. But all of a sudden we look at, the walls, that make up our home and the roof over our heads and the food in the pantry. And if we're looking at it not as something that I earned, but as something that God has blessed me with, all of a sudden that becomes not something that is just hoarded and enjoyed by myself, but we realize those are tools that God has given us to reach out to others, to help our own Christian community, but also to use as furtherance of the kingdom, as she puts it. And so I like what she says in this sit-down interview that I watched. She said, God never gets the address wrong. If your neighbors are not someone you know yet, there is a blessing waiting for you. So you just never know what can happen. I know that this isn't something that we're excelling at all. Natalie and I talk about, we really got to get better at this, at getting to know our neighbors. But we just never know what's waiting for us when we finally break the ice and kind of break through that awkwardness and start establishing relationships with the people we live next to. You never know where that can lead. Anybody else have any comments or questions before I move on? I know I've been doing a lot of talking, and I know there's people that's read this book, and I didn't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that.
Hospitality, or whatever you were saying.
Mm-hmm.
Man, that was common whenever I was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever I was in the army, we could hitchhike and go a long way.
Yep.
Nowadays, in fact, I was picking up hitchhikers and telling them the shirts that I picked up. Hitchhikers, they would just fuss at me something to it.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you might get hurt.
Yeah.
Well, I might follow them.
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. And maybe it's to my shame, but when I see a hitchhiker, I haven't done that one myself yet. But I admire those who are sometimes willing to do that. That's good for you.
Like a man got hurt, the preacher would come by, good Samaritan
Yep.
come along and helped him, and paid for his,
Yep. Put him up in an inn and took care of him, bound his wounds. Yep.
that's just, the country had just went to the dog.
Again, I should just have Frank come up here and teach these classes. So kind of, a little bit going along with what Frank just said there, he's making the point that this was something that was commonly practiced even, in his lifetime. And I think if we're being honest, we're kind of seeing this as a little bit of a lost art. But what's interesting about that is that I think we have things that should make hospitality easier. So what are some things that we're kind of blessed with in this day and age that should make hospitality easier?
More time, larger homes, and access to food.
All right? Especially compared to the first century, right? Again, when you kind of read about history, it wasn't, what's that? Yeah, we could probably do better about scheduling more time for sure. But, when you read about how people lived in the first century, they'd have this tiny home, right? And it wasn't uncommon for the whole family to sleep in one room, right? And so you can imagine these big families just sleeping in one room. And then in the wintertime, it wasn't all that uncommon to bring some of your animals in and sleep with you as well to, keep each other warm. And so that's kind of the circumstances that they were dealing with. And yet that's an era where you have Christians that are standing out for their hospitality. And so any other thoughts as far as what do we have that makes it easier to be hospitable?
The convenience to prepare, cooling water, very good. We got microwave,
Yeah.
refrigerator.
Well, and then even just reading that story of Abraham, right? He has to go and find the animal that he's going to slaughter. Oh, go through them. Oh, this is a nice one. Then he's got to kill it, and then he's got to roast it over a fire. I think it also says that he gave them curds to eat, and it's like, did he prepare that when they got there? I mean, you start thinking about it, and all the hassle that they would have to go through just to have somebody over and provide a meal for them. Not to mention the sacrifice that was made if they were poor in those days, because their poor is nothing compared to our poor. I was reading an article today that said Americans are 90 times richer than the average person at any point in history. And so, yeah, we have more resources. We tend to have bigger homes. You have things like microwaves. You have things like oven-ready meals. You have, delivery options. And so far, we're just talking about having people over. We're not to mention, cars. We can take somebody just for a cup of coffee. So we have all these kind of conveniences that should make it easier. And yet, I think we're kind of starting to find that it's a little bit of a lost art. And so I guess another way to put that and to phrase it as a question, what do you think makes it more challenging to be hospitable today? Or what makes it just challenging to be hospitable?
One of the things is that we do tend
Yeah, so and I think part of that is a priorities thing too. And, I know that, it's one thing to hear me talk about this, but I've seen some of the most busy people are also the most hospitable people. Like I see people that have been able to make it work, and I think part of it is not looking at our time and then seeing, okay, and if I have time left over, then I'll be hospitable. But looking at our time and saying, okay, what's the real priorities here? What do I have to put on my schedule first? And then, I'll worry about all the other things after that. I think that hospitality should be up there. I understand we got to take care of our families. We have, responsibilities that come with being homeowners and having families. But as David said, I think we're just too busy when that doesn't have to be the case. Larry and then David.
Yeah, sometimes everything has to be perfect.
Mhm.
House is not perfect, yard is not perfect. And that's part of it.
Yeah.
For thinking.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to what she said about radical hospitality, right? That's not making sure everything's perfect. That's last minute, hey, come over to our house, it's a mess. Sorry about that, but we want to have you over. And, I won't say never, but just people who are worried about their house being messy. Like if you're the type of person that is worried about people thinking that your house is messy, I'm telling you, it's not that big of a deal. It's the people who have no idea their house is messy. Those are the ones that you walk away and you go, that house was messy, right? David, what were you going to say? Yeah.
We're not in business of trying to compete with all historical.
Yeah.
It's just whatever's available.
Yeah, totally. And that's just how families work, right? Like when your son or daughter gets home, you're not thinking, oh man, my son or daughter, they're going to think that this house is a mess. I got to clean it up for them, right? Or your spouse. We worry about those things a little bit, right? We want to keep the house clean so our spouse doesn't have to do it. But it's not with the same level of like anxiety when we're having somebody over from church. But it really should be more like a family atmosphere. And I think that gets easier over time. Was somebody else going to say something? I thought I saw a hand go up. So, there's other things that I think factor into it. Social media, I think that it's just getting harder and harder to be sociable. I think that we're growing more and more kind of detached from, personal relationships. But it's really important. And so I know that this has been a point a few times. But when you look at widows, and this is really qualifications for widows to be enrolled, to be taken care of by the church, is what Paul's discussing here. And so he's listing, okay, this is what they should have been known for. This is the types of things they should have been doing in order to be qualified as a widow enrolled. Similar to how we would go about installing elders, right? It's kind of the same idea. But one of the things is that they had to be known for showing hospitality. And then when you look at elders, right, similarly, in both Titus and Timothy, it's kind of interesting. You don't have like the same exact words in both lists. You have some words that are the same, some words that are similar, and then a couple words that are kind of different. But in both lists, it sticks out to me that you have to be hospitable. That this is something that the elders or the prospective elder is to be known for. And so again, when we're talking about importance of hospitality, I think that this is something that is the mark of a mature Christian. Because when we read these lists, when you read a list, for example, about an elder and the qualifications of an elder, as we call them, are those things that only the elder is allowed to be known for? Really, how should we approach that list? It's not just something for us to nitpick another guy who's, we'll see if he'll be an elder or not, but what should I be looking at as well as I read that list?
This is really not qualifications as much as it is identifying characteristics or attributes of these men.
Yeah, of a godly man is really what it is. It's in both lists, Paul talks about finding somebody who is above reproach. And I think all these words that he gives are describing this is what it looks like to have a man who's above reproach. And so these are things that we should strive to integrate in our own lives as well. I saw another hand. No? Okay. So again, another reason it's important is it helps us practice what we profess. And so before I kind of give my thoughts on that, what are some things that we profess that are backed up when we show hospitality? Or what are some things we profess that are seen in our hospitality is maybe a good way to express that. Go ahead, Frank.
That's just like the thing that I hear, and I hear it all the time. And a guy asked the preacher, said, what would you say the very last sermon that you live and give to the people? He said, very simple. Read the Bible and do it.
And hospitality is a way we do that, right?
And he asked another preacher, he said, that's simple. Love Jesus.
Yeah, yeah. And so what are things that we read in the Bible, to Frank's point, that are, again, kind of backed up or acted out when we are being hospitable? Go ahead, Andy in the back.
Let's put the others first. It's hospitality is that visual evidence of loving somebody.
I saw another hand. No. So, again, things we profess. Do we profess to be Christians? We see Christians practice hospitality, right? I mean, that first church in Jerusalem, this was one of the things. And Luke, he doesn't list 100 things that they practice, right? He lists a handful. And he feels it's necessary to mention the fact that they broke bread from house to house. We claim to be a family, don't we? A number of verses that kind of talk about that, but in 1 John 3, it talks about how we're all children of God. The Christian community is talked about not only as a body, but is talked about as the household of God, the family of God. When we practice hospitality, I think we're really backing up that profession, aren't we? If we're a family, we spend time together like we do with our families. In a body, right? You take care of your body, right? We should be taking care of each other if we're really part of one body. Secondly, it provides a means to fulfill God's will. And I think this is something that Andy kind of said as well, that we're to prefer one another, honor one another, put each other first. And when we're being hospitable, that's an opportunity to show that. But we're also told things like to consider and provoke one another, stir one another up towards good works. Is not hospitality an opportunity to fulfill that command? Bear one another's burdens. It's really hard to get to that point with somebody where you're helping them through something difficult unless we're involved in their lives, unless we're maybe having them over or spending some kind of time with them. But to feed somebody, to take care of them, to put them up for a night, we're bearing a burden for them. And maybe it's a burden of loneliness. Maybe it's a burden of discouragement, or maybe it's even a financial burden. But hospitality is one way we can kind of fulfill that, as Paul says, to bear one another, each other's burdens in Galatians 6 and verse 2. Continuing on, it makes this discipline functional. So we just read about church discipline in 1 Corinthians 5 in Steve's class. How is it that hospitality makes discipline functional? I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment, but I want to see if you know what I mean.
You draw your interaction with somebody, and that's significant, that's an interaction.
Exactly, right? He says that we're not even to eat with such a person, right? Talking about the sexually immoral. But if we're not spending any time with them, where's really the discipline, right? There's no way for what Paul says here to be functional unless we're practicing hospitality, unless we're spending time with each other. And I guess one thing that I'm kind of concerned about is when the few times that I've seen church discipline acted out, where somebody's being, withdrawn from. What I've seen is that the only people that are really able to have an impact on that person is the immediate family. And that's not the way it should be. We should have such a close relationship with each other that when somebody chooses to walk in sin rather than walk with brethren, to the point where we have to withdraw from them, that should be something that is felt by that individual. And the only way that's going to be possible is if we have a real, established, strong connection with them, if we're practicing things like hospitality. Does that make sense? Helps us get along, right? breaks down barriers. It's an opportunity to get to know each other on a deeper level. And so really quickly, when we talk about who needs hospitality, right? Visitors and travelers, right? People who are coming through. When you have a Christian who is from out of town, like David Cody, and your wife as well, this is a family member that's visiting from out of town. That's really what's going on. Sorry to embarrass you. But when we have Christians visit us from out of town, that's who they are to us. They are a family visitor who is here from out of town. And how would we treat our family if they, drove 6 hours or however long to come to Wichita, Kansas? We go out of our way to make sure they have everything that they need to make sure they're taken care of. Certainly the lost, but how about widows? It's really easy for widows to get overlooked in a congregation. But I think we just need to take some time and put ourselves in their shoes and realize how hard that would be to walk your life with a spouse and then lose them, and then perhaps be forgotten about by your brothers and sisters and kind of overlooked on a Sunday morning. These are people that we have to be intentional when it comes to being hospitable, that we need to pursue hospitality. And then singles, right? Old or young. When I was in California, that was really hard. I was single at the time, and I was in a new place. I didn't know anybody, and it would have been 10 times harder if not for the hospitality of that church. And I bring this one up specifically because we have a guy, Logan Reese, and I hope he doesn't listen to this, but I think it's important. Logan Reese, I texted him, and if you don't know who he is, I think that's the first step, right? That's the first indication we need to be better about that. He's going to be back next week. He's going to school in McPherson. And I think it's time. I see kids sticking paper out the door. But he's going to school. He's from Indiana, right? He doesn't have any family here. He's 45 minutes away from church family. It's a new place, new school. He came here with no friends. I'm sure he has friends now. He's a nice guy. And so the question is, how would we want the church in Brooklyn to treat Jennifer Chim, right? She just moved to Brooklyn, and I think that we all would like to see her just embraced by that church there. She has no time right now, but eventually, hopefully, it'll get to that point. Okay, so the way that we want to see Jennifer embraced, let's do that for Logan. And the way that we've embraced her, let's do that for a guy like Logan, and not just Logan, other people that kind of fall into his similar situation. I have other things, but again, we're out of time, and I talk too long, and so I'm just going to leave you with that. Any other comments or questions as we wrap up? All right. Thank you. And make sure you give Michaela lots of hugs.